CNN.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Grazie, Mr. Prime Minister. Mr. President, in your meeting with His Holiness Pope Francis, did he register any objections with you about the contraception coverage mandate in the Affordable Care Act or your efforts to advance the rights of gays and lesbians in the United States that worry so many Catholics, and what were his concerns? And on Russia, with reports of troops building on the Ukrainian border, by taking the military option off the table, are you sending a signal to Vladimir Putin that other parts of Ukraine are his for the taking? And why not send multinational peacekeepers to the Ukrainian border as a deterrent? And to you, Mr. Prime Minister, the President said yesterday that the U.S. would defend any NATO ally. Are you making that same commitment when it comes to Russia?
That's a lot of questions there, Jim. Do the Italian journalists, by the way, do this? These sort of 5-part questions? Same thing? No comment?
Say about Italian journalism.
All right, let me try to remember this. In terms of the meeting with His Holiness Pope Francis, we had a wide-ranging discussion. I would say that the largest bulk of the time was discussing two central concerns of his. One is the issues of the poor, the marginalized, those without opportunity, and growing inequality. Those of us as politicians have the task of trying to come up with policies to address issues. But His Holiness has the capacity to open people's eyes and make sure they're seeing that this is an issue. And he's discussed in the past, I think, the dangers of indifference or cynicism when it comes to our ability to reach out to those less fortunate or those locked out of opportunity. And then we spent a lot of time talking about the challenges of conflict and how elusive peace is around the world. There was some specific focus on the Middle East, where His Holiness has a deep interest in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but also what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Lebanon, and the potential persecution of Christians. And I reaffirmed that it is central to U.S. foreign policy that we protect the interests of religious minorities around the world. But we also touched on regions like Latin America, where there's been tremendous progress in many countries, but there's been less progress in others. I think what the theme that stitched our conversation together was a belief that in politics and in life, the quality of empathy, the ability to stand in somebody else's shoes and to care for someone even if they don't look like you or talk like you or share your philosophy, that's critical. It's the lack of empathy that makes it very easy for us to plunge into wars. It's the lack of empathy that allows us to ignore the homeless on the streets. And obviously, central to my Christian faith is a belief in treating others as I'd have them treat me. And what's, I think, created so much love and excitement for His Holiness has been that he seems to live this and shows that joy continuously. In terms of domestic issues, the two issues that we touched on, other than the fact that I invited and urged him to come visit the United States, telling him that people would be overjoyed to see him, was immigration reform. As someone who came from Latin America, I think he was very mindful of the plight of so many immigrants who are wonderful people, working hard, making contributions. Many of their children are U.S. citizens, and yet they still live in the shadows, in many cases have been deported and are separated from families. I described to him how I felt that there was still an opportunity for us to make this right and get a law passed. And he actually did not touch in detail on the Affordable Care Act. In my meeting with the Secretary of State, Cardinal Pentolin, we discussed briefly the issue of making sure that that conscience and religious freedom was observed in the context of applying the law. And I explained to him that most religious organizations are entirely exempt. Religiously affiliated hospitals or universities or NGOs simply have to attest that they have a religious objection, in which case they are not required to provide contraception, although the employees of theirs who choose are able to obtain it through the insurance company. And I pledge to continue to dialogue with the U.S. Conference of Bishops to make sure that we can strike the right balance, making sure that not only everybody has health care, but families and women in particular are able to enjoy the kind of health care coverage that the ACA offers, but that religious freedom is still observed. There was a third question? What was that? The third? Okay, that's right, Russia. Okay, I remember. I think that I've been very clear in saying that we are going to do everything we can to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. But I think that it's also important for us not to promise and then not be able to deliver. There are ways for us to hopefully influence Russian decision-making, and one of the most important things that we can do on that front is ensure that the Ukrainian government is stable, that its finances are stable, and that elections go forward as currently scheduled so that we have a legitimate, strong, representative, inclusive government with an economic program that it is implementing and carrying out. And all those things are in place, but we're going to have to put a lot of resources and a lot of effort, not just the United States, but Europe as well. I've been very impressed with Prime Minister Yatsenyuk and his current efforts. The decision to go forward with an IMF program with a lot of resources is going to require a lot of courage. But keep in mind that part of what prompted the original protests that led to the previous president leaving was an objection about the same corrupt practices, an economy that was completely inefficient, that had led to a situation in which Poland's GDP had skyrocketed and the Ukrainians had plummeted when they started off at the same place just several years ago. I think the Prime Minister understands that. I think the Ukrainian people understand that. It'll require some tough decisions, but, Prime Minister Renzi is also making tough decisions. We've had to make some tough decisions. That's the nature of political leadership, and I think that's what the Ukrainian people are seeking, is a better future, even if it requires some short-term changes to business as usual.
The question for me is more clear, and the answer is easy. Yes. Yes, because I think that the crisis in Ukraine is a very bad situation. But the reaction of European Union and the United States is a reaction with one voice, not different ways, one voice. For this reason, I think the statement of G7 in Brussels and the decisions for the future our decision very important for Italy, and we are absolutely committed in this direction. ANSA.
Buonasera, confesso subito che farò anch'io più di una domanda.
No.
Rapida. Presidente Obama, lei ha espresso preoccupazione per i tagli alla difesa all'interno dei paesi NATO, dicendo che la libertà non è gratis. Ecco, però l'Europa, come lei stessa ha ricordato, sta uscendo da una dura crisi che ancora impone una serie di tagli in diversi settori, compresa la difesa. In Italia proprio in questi giorni c'è un dibattito su una possibile riduzione delle commissioni degli F-35. Come si concilia secondo lei la necessità di mettere in ordine i conti con quella di non toccare la spesa militare? Volevo anche chiederle se ha parlato con il Premier del suo pacchetto di riforme strutturali e se ritiene che sia la ricetta giusta per rilanciare il Paese, e al Premier volevo chiedere se avete avuto modo di affrontare la questione dei marò nel corso del vostro incontro. Grazie.
When it comes to defense spending, all of us have to make sure that our defense forces are efficient, effective, that for every dollar or lira that we're spending, that we're getting the most defense for our money. And so in the United States, we've reduced our defense spending as we've brought two wars to a close. There's a natural transition. The kinds of spending increases that we had seen were unsustainable. And I recognize that in Europe, and I discussed this with both Prime Minister Renzi as well as President Napolitano, there are opportunities for greater efficiencies, not only within a country's own defenses, but also by collaborating between European countries so that you don't have too much duplication and excess capacity. And in fact, Secretary General Rasmussen has repeatedly put forward plans for building NATO defense capacity in ways that reduce duplication and ensure that we are getting the most for our money. But having said that, there is a certain irreducible commitment that countries have to make if they're serious about NATO and the defense alliance. And, you know, I've been very realistic, I think, with my European partners. We, the United States, obviously have the largest military in the world, and we recognize we have some extraordinary responsibilities. We don't expect every country to duplicate exactly what we do. We have responsibilities in the Middle East. We have responsibilities in Asia, Latin America. We welcome those responsibilities, and we understand that that is a particular role that we play. But we're also a partnership in NATO, and we can't have a situation in which the United States is consistently spending over 3% of our GDP on defense, much of that focused on Europe, potentially more if we end up having ongoing crises within Europe, and Europe is spending, let's say, 1%. The gap becomes too large. Obviously, small countries will still be having a lot less capacity than us, but proportionally to their GDP, we need to make sure that everybody is doing their fair share. That's not just for our benefit, it's also because Europe's going to have its own unique defense needs. Prime Minister Renzi spoke about the Mediterranean. Conceivably, Italy is going to develop more and more specialized capacity in addressing particular challenges in North Africa or in other parts of the Mediterranean. Well, that's going to require some resources in order to do that. So this is not something that's going to have to happen overnight, but there has to be a trajectory that recognizes the need for everybody pitching in. Because As I said yesterday, we cannot take our freedom for granted.